It is 11:30. You know what that means. It's time to talk all things people, power, and politics in Detroit. Welcome to The Pulse. I'm Roop Raj. Add an open Senate seat to an open governor, Secretary of State, and an Attorney General seat in Michigan in the next few years. And speculation about who now will replace Gary Peters is building even at this hour. That's our big story tonight. But we're also diving into the funding freeze at the federal level. You probably heard about this. President Trump trying to pause all federal grants and loans, but a judge said not so fast, at least for now. A closer look at that. And a new layer to an idea that has many of you talking, the possible renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to a Gulf of America. A major website many of you probably use today will change the names of both the Gulf and the Denali mountaintops. We'll take you inside those plans from a big tech giant. But we begin with the news impacting all of us in Michigan. Senator Gary Peters says he won't seek re-election in 2026, following in the footsteps of Debbie Stabenow, who opted not to run last year. Peters made it clear it's not a retirement, but says it's time for something new.
After 3 terms in the House and 2 terms in the Senate, I believe now is time for me to write a few more paragraphs in my current chapter and then turn over the reins. I will therefore not seek re-election in 2026. Although I will not be on the ballot next year, I will not just walk away. I plan to actively campaign to ensure we elect a dynamic Democratic candidate to be the next U.S. Senator from Michigan.
It almost looked like a campaign ad, but it's actually an ad saying that you're stepping down. Peters was first elected to the Senate in 2014 after longtime Michigan Senator Carl Levin announced his retirement. Of course, reaction is pouring in right now with this major announcement from elected leaders to you at home. We're getting a pulse check across the board. Take a listen.
Senator Peters did a very good job. I was stunned by it. I'm going to go ahead and make news. I promised people that I wouldn't take it off the table, that I'm not running. But I've got too important a job to do right now in the House. I'm the dean of the delegation. I got to fight for these issues. I am not somebody who is meant to go out and do nothing but raise money. There are a lot of good, qualified people looking at it. No, I'm not running for the United States Senate.
We're grateful for his service to the state of Michigan. It's going to open up a very competitive U.S. Senate race from both, I think, the Democratic primary, but also for the general election, and we'll see how many people jump into the race. But a lot of things are going to be on the ballot in 2026 is really what that told us. I was surprised by his announcement, and we'll see sort of who throws their hat in the ring.
We're hearing a lot of names right now. We're also hearing from you on social media. I asked, what are your thoughts on him not seeking re-election? And we had a lot of people responding. In fact, Mari told me this. She said, I think he's hoping for a blue wave at the midterms and that a fresh face will help with that. But Jim had a very different prediction, saying very concisely this: I think the state is leaning red in the midterms. And finally, Andrew told me this. He alluded to a younger generation. Then a few hours later, the news was suggesting Pete Buttigieg might run. That's the younger handoff because Democrats believe he is destined for the presidency. As for who could replace him, obviously it's still very early, but that is one name we're hearing, like Transportation Secretary, the former one, Pete Buttigieg, who moved to Michigan not long after his 2020 run for president. He lives in Traverse City. Also, State Senator Mallory McMurrow, who also says she's looking at a run for governor. And Congresswoman Haley Stevens is considering a run as well. That's according to the Associated Press, who's citing a person familiar with the matter. And you know the Pulse will be here to cover the entire thing from beginning to end, so buckle up. Staying in D.C., but heading to the executive branch. Another day, another blizzard of orders coming from the Trump administration. A lot to dive into, so let's power through some of the big headlines, starting with this. More than a dozen Department of Justice employees fired. And the common thread for all of them, they worked on the criminal prosecutions of now President Trump. Those firings are effective immediately, and it goes against the norm where rank-and-file prosecutors usually stay with the department no matter who is in the Oval Office. The DOJ says the firings were because the acting AG simply doesn't trust the prosecutors to implement Trump's aggressive agenda. Now, from the Justice Department, let's take you to the Department of Defense. That's where the president ordered new Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth to revise the Pentagon's policy involving transgender troops. Now, that order likely sets the stage for a future ban. Trump tried to ban transgender troops during his first term, but it got caught up in court before it was overturned by the Biden administration. Two groups who fought the ban the first time say they'll fight it once again. And speaking of government employees, at least 56 senior officials in the U.S. Agency for International Development, better known as USAID, are on leave at this hour. That's as an investigation plays out into whether there was an effort to thwart Trump's orders. The president directed a 90-day pause on most foreign aid last week, but the aides were put on leave. They were trying to help organizations deal with the freeze and get waivers to keep efforts like delivering clean water to people in Sudan, to monitoring the bird flu around the globe. But this is a story that's really not going anywhere, and it really is everybody talking. A federal judge blocking the Trump administration's freeze on federal grants and loans minutes before it was supposed to be enforced. Now, that pause runs until Monday. The White House wanted the freeze to do an ideological review of how federal money is spent, but caused panic in organizations that rely on money from D.C. So many questions about that. What will be impacted? What won't be impacted if this takes effect? The Trump administration says programs that give direct assistance to Americans will not be affected. So think Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, student loans, and food stamps. But what's not clear is how programs like Meals on Wheels or programs within, say, the Department of Health and Human Services would be impacted if this does take effect. We talked to the nonpartisan Michigan League for Public Policy as well as Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib just hours ago. Here's what they have to say.
I'm concerned about the constitutionality of this. So the National Council of Nonprofits, as well as other organizations, have filed an injunction to stop this order. There are a number of attorney generals throughout the country that have also filed suit or are about to file suit.
I hope they listen to the judge. Doing this in this kind of rapid pace is incredibly difficult for many nonprofit organizations. Many of these are amazing partners of the federal government that does, AmeriCorps program, early childhood program. I had calls from different folks that are doing research on behalf of the federal government. But we know this, that it's unconstitutional. It's an unconstitutional power grab to do what the administration has done. I mean, the president and the administration doesn't have any authority to block funding that has already been appropriated by Congress. No matter the political affiliation of the president, they have to understand, the president has the opportunity to veto spending when it comes to his or her desk, but once it's signed into law, it's the law.
The Trump administration defended the freeze, saying it's the president following through on a promise to turn Washington on its head if reelected. Now to the Gulf of Mexico, which President Trump's ordered to be renamed the Gulf of America. The AP, Fox, and all of the local stations are calling it by the Gulf of Mexico for now, but now a major website is announcing how it will handle this and another landmark. Google Maps says they'll change that name and the name of Denali for U.S. users as soon as the government updates its official listings. The database they're watching is what's called the Geographic Names Information System. It's Google who said in a post on X the company has long had a practice of applying name changes when they're updated in government sources. The president ordered the Gulf change, as well as switching Denali's name back to Mount McKinley quickly after taking office. By the way, we talked about how these changes work and the fact that the president can't just rename the Gulf unilaterally on Thursday's episode of The Pulse. If you missed that episode, you can scan the QR code on the bottom right of your screen. You'll be able to watch the full episode, a full library of our shows. We're so glad you made this your choice for political news. So many of you tune in each and every night. All right, we are diving into the news dominating Michigan politics today. Senator Gary Peters not seeking re-election. A Democrat and a Republican you know well debate who should run to replace him. You're watching The Pulse on Fox 2. Thank you, brother. Back now on The Pulse, looking at all things people, power, and politics from the D to D.C. And joining us now to talk about Senator Gary Peters not seeking re-election, former State House Majority Leader Rocky Rishkowski and former Democratic State Representative Sherry Gay Dagnago. Good to see both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for.
We only have a few minutes. We want to get into this. I want to begin by asking you about this U.S. Office of Management and Budget, the spending freeze on federal assistance. I want to begin with you, Rocky. If the shoe is on the other foot, and Biden just got into office and suddenly froze all this stuff because he says he wanted to wait a little while to kind of assess it, and there were people like at Head Start programs in California and other places that were like, hey, what are we going to do with our money? What would you say?
Well, first, let me go back and say that the White House has addressed that specifically today, and they said that they're just reviewing all the programs, but there's no stop in funding. And one of the things that you had in the previous segment, which is absolutely correct, once Congress appropriates, the president signs. If it's specifically appropriated, it's specifically appropriated. If it's not specifically appropriated, if it's just a general appropriation, then the president can do a review of that budget, and that's exactly what's happening.
But it is a freeze, though, Rocky, and this federal judge stopped the freeze. It would have been a freeze,
and the federal judge stopped the freeze, but most importantly, this administration stated that it's just going through a review process of what's being appropriated.
Sherry, the federal judge, obviously many people grateful in the nonprofit world that this federal judge stepped in the way. Are you worried about what will happen after Monday?
I am, and more than that, I mean, Rocky, that's being a little disingenuous, and you know, as being the Republican leader, that when we appropriated funding to go to a number of organizations, the citizens in the state of Michigan are not looking at red and blue. If they need those services, we appropriated that funding. It was to go to those organizations, and to halt it on a dime is not taking into consideration all the needs that the citizens have. And so that's a huge problem that the president has created. I'm glad that the judge stepped in, but what happens after Monday? What happens to them addressing and dealing with our school funding and trying to stop funding that's going to our Title I programs? This is a serious issue.
All that goes to the states, and again, it's just a review process.
But that's not just a review. They said halted. They said halted
for a specific review.
But perhaps for 90 days. Perhaps for 90 days.
But a budget, you know, many of these organizations operate on a very thin budget.
A shoestring budget, yes.
So come on now, if they halt it, you could put people out of service.
We will revisit this with Rocky, with Sherry, and the rest of you.
I hope we do.
Listen, we have to, because these are unprecedented times. These are measures that this president is taking. And he's basically saying, hey, we got to freeze, and the judge said, forget about it, Mr. President. Hold your horses, and perhaps for good reason. We'll have to watch this one carefully. Let's talk about the story that everybody in Michigan is talking about, Senator Peters. Now we have a list of people who are throwing their hats in the ring. We'll begin with you, Sherry. Some of the Democratic names we're hearing that may step in: Pete Buttigieg, Representative Haley Stevens, Senator McMurrow, Wayne County Health Director Dr. Abdul Al-Sayed, and then we have Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist.
Absolutely, I was shocked you didn't have his picture up.
Let me ask you, well, you're here to talk about him.
Yes.
Why do you believe, because I know you posted on social very heavily, that you believe that Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist is the man for the job? And I ask you this question objectively.
Absolutely.
But I asked you this question objectively, and I'm going to ask you this. This is a man who is extremely intelligent. He's brilliant. Everyone knows that. He's a leader. But he's never run for an elected office. He was appointed as lieutenant governor. Can this seat be risked with someone who hasn't run a campaign? What do you think could happen next?
He has ran a campaign, although that campaign was not initially successful. My first campaign wasn't successful either, but he has ran a campaign.
But
so let's get that.
One on a campaign.
Right, but one on a campaign, I get that. And sometimes it's the second time around.
Sure.
That's the charm. But he has had the benefit of serving as lieutenant governor around this state now for 5 years, I think we're at right now. And so he has name ID. He's been into the communities. He's had opportunity to work on policy and legislation. He understands the appropriation process. He understands the legislative process. And so he is a candidate that many of our community leaders are looking at already to say he's the one. He had his mind set on potentially running for governor. But I believe that this is an opportunity right now for the party to get behind Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist, a fractured party, I might say. That is always punted to the next person in line that just happens to not be black.
Note down the time and date, 11:50. You agreed. Okay, I want to ask you a little bit about the why. So someone like Pete Buttigieg, who's had federal experience and also local experience, and then you have others like Haley Stevens, Senator McMurrow, Dr. Abdul Sayed.
All of them unqualified.
But how does Pete get a pass in Michigan? What has he ran for in Michigan? What I mean, so what name might be other than him being the head of the Department of
Transportation?
Transportation?
Again.
So why is he even a factor right now? I get his pedigree.
So let's talk about and we have representation that matters too, and obviously you're talking about having black leadership in the Senate. There's a man named Representative John James, who you know well.
Absolutely.
He's an African American who is currently serving in Washington. His name is on the list as well.
Yeah, and John, no matter what John runs for, John James has got incredible talent, incredible skill, and incredible experiences. Unlike every single one of the Democratic candidates who have never written a paycheck to somebody else except themselves, looked for political positions. John has actually excelled in the military, excelled in business, and excelled in public service. And that's the type of person that Michigan wants. But more importantly, Roop, all the candidates that we discussed on the Democratic side that are popping their names in the wish basket, I got to tell you, all those individuals would turn us back to the Biden era. Every single one of them supported the Biden administration, which lost to Michigan by 80,000 votes.
But Rocky, shouldn't this party, obviously fractured, it be?
It is for the Dem Party.
But isn't this an opportunity then for the Democrats to rebuild the party based on figures that are good at this?
It is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to rebuild the party and to be respectful and not take for granted the most dedicated, committed, and loyal demographic that exists in the Democratic Party, and that is African American leadership,
which are now looking more and more towards the Republican Party.
Well, 20% of the guys did, but 92% of the women voted for Kamala Harris, unlike the other party. But the Democratic Party, I served them notice that now is an opportunity for them to really put some action behind their words. If they really respect black leadership, don't punt and create an opportunity where they just advance the seat like they did for
Rocky, Republicans haven't won a seat in 30 years, since 94.
Yeah,
What changed? 94. What changes?
The change is showing what Republicans offer the people, how they serve the people, and most importantly, going into the inner cities and talking to the African American
Garland Gilchrist is from the inner cities.
And he lives in Farmington Hills. Thank you very much.
No, he does not.
Yes, he does.
No, he doesn't.
But Garland listen.
No, he lives downtown.
I thought he lived in Farmington Hills.
No, he has a loft in downtown.
Then he lived in Farmington Hills.
Well, maybe he did. Look, let people move and change their residencies all the time.
Who cares where they live?
Lives in Traverse City, but he's
as long as we have Michigan values and we care about Michigan people, and that's what's most important.
Are there names that we haven't heard yet that you believe will be popping up shortly?
I'm sure there will be a number of people who throw their name in every race, but right now I believe the steady train, the steady candidate that we all look forward to getting behind is Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist.
And I reached out to Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist, and if you're watching this, Lieutenant Governor, we invite you on the show. If you decide to throw your name in the hat, we'll have anyone who decides they want this job on this set. We thank Rocky Richkowski and Sherry Gay-Degnago for joining us here on The Pulse tonight.
Thank you.
Always a very dull moment with the two of you. Never.
Put Garland's picture up next time.
Listen, well, we talked about him for a while. Absolutely. The sweeping executive orders from the president have so many people talking, some concerned about possible civil rights issues. We're sitting down with a renowned Detroit pastor and activist to get his thoughts. The Pulse is back after this. It is People, Power, and Politics. Thanks for staying up late with us here on The Pulse. Here to talk about his concerns about the president's executive orders. Pastor Horace Sheffield, a longtime activist and media figure here in the Motor City. And we should mention, we'd be remiss if we didn't say, we also invited Pastor Lorenzo Sewell, a friend of President Donald Trump's, who simply could not make it at the last minute. But
he had to get more sleep so he can find another dream.
Well, apparently
that doesn't belong to him.
The speech that he gave at the inauguration was
It was one of the most remorseful things. I knew Dr. King.
Yeah.
Been to his house. He's been to our house. My dad was with him from '57. I mean, it's just
and
mockery.
he delivered the speech here before them all in Washington.
Right. Yeah. And the buffoonery with which he took something that is exalted speech in American iconic history. But I don't want to spend all my time on him.
Well, listen, let's not talk about that. Yeah. If he was here, he would have a chance to talk back to you. But I want to talk about this, what we're looking at with this administration right now. Specifically when it comes, we had Osama Siblani here with the Arab American News yesterday. He says that members in his community are concerned about the ICE raids that are happening right now. You are someone who always looks out for people, regardless of if they're black or white or brown, people who are in marginalized communities. What are your big concerns right now now as we look at this.
I was really concerned today because I have several federal grants.
Yeah.
And to show you how vicious this can be, normally when there's some kind of pause on the PMS system, they'll tell you it'll be down sometimes a week in advance. So this announcement goes out and you have to 5 p.m. today to pull your money, but then the system was down until 3:45, saying it was going through some kind of, repair.
Right.
I mean, it was deliberate.
Well, when in fact it wasn't a repair, but rather there was the freeze, and then the federal judge came and said, "Hold on, we got to freeze the freeze for a moment," right?
And that's when the money. And everybody that I know, a lot of my friends were concerned because I mean, you people who work, I mean, do good work. Non-political work. I mean, I'm out here helping people with their health status. I mean, in the Detroit Recovery Project, friends like that. I was on the phone with Marvin Winans today, and his, at least his staff. And, my good friend Clark Durant is Republican. Got on the phone with him, and we began to look into some things. But this is the kind of stuff that really creates a new definition of DEI: destructive, evil, and intentional.
Well, and listen, you have an issue. I got to ask you the question. Do you believe that this freeze comes with the intention to actually look at some of the money and understand how much government spending is wasted?
In his executive order, he talked about wokeism and money going for DI. I mean, there was an intentional...
And there are questions about that in this spending freeze on federal assistance for programs that don't align with his thoughts. But let me ask you in general, do you believe that the federal government under Democrat Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the vice president was simply spending too much money? Do you believe that?
No,
and even under the
Donald Trump has spent more money than any president. I mean, the only time they're concerned about money being spent is when someone else spends it. This guy's been fiscally unresponsible altogether during his entire 4 years. And here's a guy, by the way, who's taking advantage of all kinds of loopholes, don't pay any taxes, but he's concerned about what average Americans are getting from grants. It's absurd.
What are you thinking in terms of what happens on Monday once this freeze on the freeze expires?
Well, I know for a fact that a lot of Republicans were concerned, and I think at some point, if he continues down the road he's going, he's going to lose some of the support who's been quiet and afraid to present, their disapproval. I mean,
what difference does it make, though, Reverend, with all due respect, when it's a lame duck president who literally is not campaigning for office?
But look what he's done in the 2 weeks he's been there with executive orders. I mean, he's created absolute chaos. I mean, I talked to people today who are friends of mine who just totally were losing it, trying to figure out how they're going to keep the agencies open. I mean, just so you can review whether or not, and by the way, my organization's name is Detroit Association of Black Organizations. So my friend that I talked to, Republican, well, we'll let the president know that, what you do. Look, I mean, he looks at my name and figures, oh, we ain't give no money.
Do you believe that this federal government does, though, need shaking up?
I believe the country needs, new direction, but I don't think we'll ever get back to the civility and sanity that we once knew. I mean, I think about Republicans that I thought were the worst people in the world. I would take Ronald Reagan over Donald Trump. I mean, George Bush and all these people who were civil and sane. I mean, and comported with the standards of government. This guy does something completely
We've talked
different.
to other pastors during Trump's last administration, and they talked about opportunity zones. They talked about the reversal of that terrible, what they call the predator bill that at the time President Biden signed on for, 94. Yeah. This president has done for black Americans a lot. Would you say, would you recognize that? Or
I will give you this. I think part of the problem that we've had in the Democratic Party is that some of the stuff we embrace is not mainstream enough. I have a lot of, I'm a pastor, I have a lot of pastor friends of mine who just could not get with the, transgender agenda and all those kind of things. I think the Democratic Party, and I'm glad Sherry's here tonight to hear this, has to really sit down and figure out what are the major issues that affect the vast majority of Americans.
Reverend Sheffield, we're out of time. I want to say thank you for joining us here on The Pulse tonight. Always good to see you. And yes, we extend our invitation to any other pastor that's out there on a conservative point of view who'd like to join us as well to address some of these issues.